Hello everyone, my name's Phil Calvert and a very warm welcome to the Financial Advisor Mastermind and Challenge. Throughout this week, advisors, leading experts and consultants to the financial planning profession are sharing amazing insights into just what makes a world-class financial advice business. Today I'm delighted to be speaking with someone who's a retail theft and card fraud consultant, in particular authorized push payment fraud. He's the BBC's go-to expert, and you may well know him from programs such as Watchdog and BBC Moneybox. Really excited to welcome Richard Emery. How are you, Richard?
Good morning. Thank you very much indeed, Phil, for allowing me to be part of this very important program. I hope that what I share, your IFA colleagues will actually find to be very helpful.
I'm sure they will, and it's a really important topic we're discussing today, and that of fraud. And just as a bit of backstory for financial advisors watching this, only one or two of you know about this, but a few months ago, my mother was defrauded out of a significant amount of money, where she was contacted by somebody purporting to be her bank. Her husband had died a few months earlier, and she'd eventually decided to sell his share of the business, and the proceeds of that were basically sitting in a bank account, and she was getting ready to talk to her financial advisor. She's lost a huge amount of money, and I was listening to BBC Watchdog, listening to Moneybox one Saturday morning. My ears pricked up because I suddenly found myself listening to the story of a lady where pretty well an identical thing had happened to her. And Richard was the person who was talking about this. Richard, can you just give us a sense of the scale of this issue, first of all?
Well, let's leap straight in on the question of the scale. This is a major problem. It is a problem that has been growing quite dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years. And as things stand today, authorized push payment fraud is costing individuals, charities and small businesses approximately £1 million per day.
Wow.
So if you actually take the published figures, 2017, the published figure was £236 million. 2018, we're expecting a figure of around £400 million. Now, what's really important is there is a very significant difference between authorized push payment fraud and unauthorized theft by a fraudster from a bank account. So if an individual inadvertently allows the fraudster to gain access to their account and the fraudster takes the money from the account, the bank generally, and we'll come on to details later, but the bank generally has an obligation to refund that money. But with authorized push payment fraud, prior to the 31st of January this year, the bank had no obligation whatsoever to refund the money because the individual authorized the transaction.
Right. So before we dive into the different types of fraud, can you just give us a bit of backstory? Tell us how you came to be involved and how you came to be doing what you're doing today, because I get the distinct feeling that people like you are going to be in much demand.
Well, okay, very quick summary of my story was I originally trained in accountancy, decided that was boring, sorry IFAs, and went into computing, got involved in design and development of point of sale systems, obviously payment systems, worked for John Lewis Partnership, worked for ICL Retail Systems, set up my own consultancy, got involved in civil dispute management on fitness for purpose of computer systems, then got drawn into the whole area of criminal defense of people accused of theft and fraud. That in turn took me into doing 1 or 2 pieces for radio and TV. And really in the last 6 years, I have focused entirely on theft and fraud in respect of debit credit cards. And now exclusively, I work in the area of online bank fraud. And
Right.
to give you some idea of scale, I'm currently dealing with a total value of fraud of somewhere around about £2.5 million of people who have come to me and are seeking to recover money that they've lost.
Right. Now, I would imagine it is pretty well inevitable that a typical financial planner, an IFA, is going to have clients either now or at some point in the future and who are going to be affected by this.
Yeah.
And part of my thinking for wanting to talk to you today is that, to me, it seems a no-brainer that as part of the value that financial advisors add, they should be educating clients about issues such as this. Would I be right in that kind of thinking?
A, you would be right, and B, I very much hope that this podcast actually helps do part of that education process.
Yeah.
To create a much greater understanding of the way in which fraudsters work, and therefore what are the things that people need to be on the lookout for. But remembering that fraud is constantly changing. Fraudsters are finding new ways of attacking people, and some of them they are very subtle. They are very clever. We may actually talk about what's being called the TV license scam, and it might be helpful to just explain at some point how that scam actually works and how the fraudsters manipulate people, so that the IFAs can understand how that works.
And where I'm hoping we can get to later on in our conversation is what the IFA community as a whole could do to actually potentially make things a bit easier for consumers.
Okay.
Fantastic. So let's get stuck into, I believe you kind of really focus on, there's 3 types of fraud. Do you want to sort of start taking us through maybe the first one?
Can I just go back and do a little piece of education? I talked about unauthorized transactions and authorized transactions.
Yeah.
I think it might just be helpful for your community to understand the situation with unauthorized fraud is that if somebody attacks your bank account and they take money from your account, the bank has an obligation to refund that money unless, and there are 3 what I call get out of jail free cards that the banks sometimes play. One of them is if you have acted fraudulently, the bank doesn't have to give you the money back. The second one is if you have intentionally breached the terms and conditions of your account, they don't have to give the money back. And the third one is if you have been grossly negligent.
Okay.
Let's just deal with intent for a moment. Intent means you're sitting in the office, it's pouring with rain, you want £50 from the ATM down the road, you give your card and your PIN to a colleague, they go down to the ATM, they withdraw £500, give you £50, you can't claim the other £450 back from the bank because with intent, you broke the terms and conditions of your card.
Yeah.
Doesn't happen a lot. I have dealt with some cases like that. But gross negligence has been historically a major problem. The banks were accusing people of being grossly negligent when actually they were the victims of increasingly sophisticated fraud. I identified this issue at the beginning of 2017, and during 2017 and 18, I worked with the Financial Ombudsman Service, the All-Party Parliamentary Group, a number of MPs, and by mid-18, we had actually redefined the way gross negligence would be accepted. And I'm currently in the privileged position of seeing something in the order of £750,000 being refunded to people where historically they were accused of being grossly negligent. And the Financial Ombudsman Service is now saying, we've reviewed our position on this, banks, you have to give the money back.
Yeah.
So if somebody comes to you and historically they were the victim of unauthorized fraud on their account, tell them to raise a complaint and even go back to their bank and re-raise the complaint. So let's just park that, but it does show that the world is moving on.
Good.
Now let's come to the issue you raised, which is authorized payment fraud. Now, since our last conversation, I've actually felt it would be helpful to tackle 5 areas, not 3.
Okay,
so
great.
Just expand the scope. The important thing here is to understand the consumer, the victim, is authorizing the payment. So we start off with a very simple scenario of what I call authorized consumer fraud. So this is, you see an advert for an item, you respond to the advert for the item, you send off the money, you never get the item. Now that could be something relatively cheap on a local web trading site. Actually, there's a major issue around motor cars. There's a team based out in Eastern Europe somewhere, and they set up a fake company, they set up a fake advert, they offer motor cars for sale, 50% deposit, and then 50% on delivery of the car. Of course, the car is never delivered.
No.
So there are literally hundreds of victims who have lost typically between £5,000 and £10,000. And because they authorised it, there is no recompense. So that's consumer fraud. And people know that they've lost the money because the item doesn't arrive.
Mm.
I'm currently involved in a court case where we are actually seeking to break new ground and to sue the receiving bank. So we're not suing the sending bank, we're suing the receiving bank to get the money back. So that's a complicated process, but we're trying to break new ground through the civil courts. So watch this space. We think the bank will settle before we get to court, but we're pushing it.
Yeah.
So the next thing is another big issue, which is what we call expected payment fraud. So this would be, for example, you're having some work done on your house. You're regularly in communication with your builder. Your builder regularly sends you updates, and then one day they send you an invoice, which is either going to be an attached Word document or it's going to be a PDF. However, that document has been tampered with between them sending it and you receiving it. The account details have been changed, so you now pay the money to the wrong person.
Right.
You pay the money to the fraudster. So you know within 48 hours that that's gone wrong, because your builder is now chasing you and saying, where's my money? And you're saying, I've paid it. And you're saying, where did it go? But that is money which is lost. And that really is a big part of the £1 million a day that people are losing. So that's expected payment fraud. We then have something which is quite subtle as well, which I think your IFAs need to be very aware of, is CEO fraud. So this is where the accounts department in a company gets an email from the CEO of the company with an attached invoice saying, please pay this urgently. But actually the company's email system has been compromised, and that message didn't actually come from the CEO themselves. It came from outside. So we don't see many of those, but they do tend to be high value.
Right.
Then we come on to possibly in many respects the most wicked of all, which is account transfer fraud. Now that's actually what Liz was the victim of. And I could talk about the story of a couple of people who've been involved in account transfer fraud. And so this means that you receive a phone call from somebody who quickly persuades you that they are your bank. They tell you a story that your account is under attack. They tell you that they've created a new bank account for you, which is safe. And in one case, they actually pretended that bank account was in the cloud. It's very interesting because an older person will go, oh, the bank account's in the cloud. Does that make it safe? So they build this yarn. They're very sophisticated, and they persuade people to move all the money from their current account into a new safe account. But of course, that's not a new safe account. And typically within 24 to 48 hours, you've realized what's gone wrong and all your money has been lost. And then the last one, which I want to talk about, is investment fraud. So a particular case here is there's a high street bank and they have a private banking division. The private banking division had their website cloned. So what this person was seeing was a cloned version of the private banking division's website. Everything checked out. The website looked fine. The paperwork they were sent looked fine. They checked the FCA registration number. That was fine. At the end of the day, they actually took £103,000. They asked their bank to transfer the money to the private bank where it would be invested on their behalf. Now, that was an authorised payment.
Yeah.
The account that received that money was fraud. Now, what's particularly worrying about this type of fraud is most people are not going to find out about it for a year when they don't actually receive any payments in terms of interest or anything else. This guy was contacted after 3 months by his bank because somebody had identified the receiving account was being run by fraudsters. So 3 months after handing over £103,000, having done everything he reasonably could to validate that what he was doing was right, all of a sudden, he now finds out that £103,000 is lost and he has no form of recovery. So those are the sorts of scenarios that we're looking at. So consumer fraud, expected payment fraud, CEO fraud, account transfer fraud, and investment fraud. And they are constantly developing. I could talk to you in a month's time and I'll be telling you number 6.
Yeah.
I can't predict at the moment what number 6 will be, but these 5 are all pretty bad.
I mean, that last one sounds horrific.
Yes.
Cloning financial organizations. And that has, well, I mean, that's a rabbit hole we don't want to go down, but people are finding themselves in that situation. And to me, that has very distinct potential to come across the desk of financial advisors in some way.
Yeah, that's why I raised that. And there is a little concern here as well. Well, actually, to be honest, quite a big concern, which is one company identified that their website had been cloned. They contacted the Financial Conduct Authority, and it took the Financial Conduct Authority 15 days to close down the receiving account that was on the back end. So I now have a client who actually put money into that investment in that 15-day window. And we're now saying to the Financial Conduct Authority, well, hang on a minute, you were told by the genuine company their website had been cloned, and it took you 15 days to actually freeze the account into which these people were paying their money. So we're looking at, it's a complex question. Where does liability lie?
Yeah.
Because the FCA is saying, well, it took us a while because we have to validate it. But one of the comments that I've seen in this whole conversation is people would actually rather have false warnings. And in fact, this is what this investment company said, is we'd rather have a false warning rather than actually see potential clients' money being lost.
Right.
Let me just talk about a couple of the numbers that sit behind this as well. When UK Finance published their figures for 2017, they said the average value of authorised push payment fraud is £2,800. So when that figure gets published, people go, oh, well, it's not a serious problem. We don't need to worry about it.
Mm.
When I actually sat in front of the Treasury Select Committee and explained it, I said this: that is an accurate value for the average. But when you start applying an 80-20 or a 90-10 or a 95-5% split, you start realizing it's actually not quite like that.
No.
And there are a lot of people who have lost small amounts of money and a relatively modest amount of people who've lost a lot. And it's those people that I'm concerned about. Yeah. I reckon there's very little published information because UK Finance are being a little bit coy. But my estimate on my forensic analysis says something in the order of 10,000 people a year for the last 5 years have lost on average £20,000 each. My own client portfolio at that point, when I was speaking to the Treasury Select Committee, had 31 clients, and their average loss was £51,000 each.
Yeah.
4 of my clients attended my evidence session to the Treasury Select Committee, and they spoke up, and I commented, and I said, the 4 people sitting behind me, between them, they've lost £450,000.
Yeah.
Lisa could not be there, but I'm going to tell you Lisa's story.
Please, yes.
Lisa's story is an account transfer fraud. Mm. So Lisa received a phone call from who she believed was her bank, and she was told that she needed to move her money to a safe account. Now, her bank actually had a rule that said there was a limit to how much she could transfer in a single payment. So she made a payment to the new payee of £20,000. So literally, she created a new payee, and within a few minutes, she paid £20,000. She then paid another £20,000 and a third £20,000. Her bank did not notice that she'd made 3 £20,000 to a new payee in the space of a few minutes. They didn't notice when she did the 4th one. They didn't notice when she did the 5th one. She's now transferred £100,000. That's the limit for one account. So she was then told she needed to move the remaining £150,000 to a second account. She did 5 more payments from that account, moved the £60,000 to a third account, and did 4 more payments out of that account. 14 payments totaling £277,000, and the bank did not notice that that was happening.
Yeah.
Now, you know, what can you say about a banking system that is meant to, according to this bank's website, we actively monitor all accounts for unusual transaction patterns? 14 payments of £20,000 made within 2 hours of a new payee being created, and the bank didn't notice it.
Yeah.
We really do have a serious problem with some of our banks.
And does that not make them complicit in the fraud?
Well, this is difficult because you're now walking into a legal area.
Yeah.
And that's a real challenge. You know, where does responsibility, what constitutes being complicit? Well, of course, the other important element is we could now move on and look at the receiving account. Now, that's actually where my big focus is on the receiving account. So this is where we need to understand the nature of the accounts where the money goes. And here we have 3 types of account. Generically speaking, there are 3 sorts of accounts where stolen money goes. Now, the first of those, which the banks always want to talk about, UK Finance always wants to talk about these, are Mule accounts. So these are accounts which are open legitimately, are being run and managed legitimately, but are being used to process stolen funds. I've seen figures from one bank who said they identified 13,000 Mule accounts. There are figures published by CFAS that talk about 8,000 Mule accounts. And the overwhelming majority of these are students between the ages of 16 and 25.
Okay.
If you actually search the right places on the web, you will find adverts from fraudsters who are simply saying, you can process this stolen money. I mean, it isn't quite dressed up like this, but the reality is you can process this stolen money and you can keep 10%. And there's no risk because very, very few people are ever investigated by the police because it's relatively low level values. The police generally don't investigate anything under £100,000. So what you have is accounts where the bank will say, well, the account was opened legitimately. All the transactions were being authorised legitimately. What could we do? Now, I need to actually give credit to Lloyds because Lloyds have actually put a significant program in place, and they identified an account through an account monitoring software, and they were actually able to capture the money when it went into the account and before it left the account. So there is some development there. But the ones that really concern me are the next 2 categories, which is banks which are opened with fake ID and banks which are opened with fake businesses. So you can go, historically, you could go to Companies House, register a small business, and the degree of validation they did on director's ID was a little lightweight, to be polite. And of course, you then ended up with a business account where you could process reasonable amounts of money quite quickly. And equally the same with fake ID accounts. So somebody will walk into a bank, they'll present an ID card and a utility bill. And those are both acceptable forms of ID, but the question is, does the bank undertake due diligence? So we end up with an account which has been opened in the name of John Smith, but it's actually been opened by Fred Jones.
Yeah.
And in this situation, we are currently looking at a regulatory challenge on the banks because the receiving bank was operating an account which was in one person's name, but actually being operated by somebody else. And there's a regulatory issue around that we are currently exploring.
Okay.
That just gives you an idea, the sort of flavour.
Yeah.
Now, what I then need to move on to is just to talk about what's happened on the 31st of January.
Yes.
So 2 years ago, the Consumers Association raised a super complaint. And eventually, after 2 years, the banks have come forward with something which is, well, officially there's a new code of practice and there's a new process by which people can actually now make complaints. Because historically, with push payment fraud, you couldn't complain to your bank because your bank did what you told them to do. And you couldn't complain to the receiving bank because you were not a customer. And what the new process does is the new process is designed to allow you to make a complaint about the receiving bank. And the remit of the Financial Ombudsman Service has been extended so that they can now consider complaints against the receiving bank, which you are not a customer of. How this is going to work, the jury is out.
Yeah.
I've read some of the paperwork and I am a little concerned about it. I should also point out that the new code of practice that the banks are meant to be operating to has not been ratified. So that was all meant to have been ratified by the 31st of January, and it hasn't been ratified yet because they're trying to work out who's going to fund all the refunds that have to go back to customers. So there's a lot of complex stuff going on, which has still got to be resolved. And one of the areas I'm concerned about is how they will judge the behaviour of the individual. Because I talked earlier about gross negligence in terms of unauthorised payments.
Yeah.
The question is, are banks going to turn around and say, well, actually, the victim of an authorised payment fraud was grossly negligent? And if so, what will the test be? And how will gross negligence be assessed?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the cases of Liz, the cases of my mother,
Yeah,
remarkably similar stories
Yeah.
where multiple payments were made out.
Yeah.
It does make you question, what are they doing in the banks? Now, I'll give you an example of my mum. She banked with, let's name them, NatWest, since the early 1950s. Her payment profile was probably identical since the time the account was opened right up until this year.
Yeah.
Since her husband died, the most she would have ever taken out of her account at any one time might be a few thousand for her annual holiday, but certainly not multiple payments of tens of thousands of pounds over a period of days. And my head says, why didn't they notice this? What's wrong with the system?
Yeah. Well, what's wrong with the system is the absence of effective account monitoring. Having had a background in retail and retail systems, I'm aware of the fact that there's an enormous amount goes on to actually look at the performance of individual branches, individual product ranges. How is product range X doing against product range Y? How is this part of the country doing compared to that part of the country? So when the banks open a student account, and I highlight those because they're widely used for Mule Accounts, when a bank opens a student account, surely there should be a profile that says the maximum amount that we expect to go into this account in any one individual payment is, say, £10,000 because their parents are putting money in to cover tuition fees. The maximum amount that should be going out would be, and they should be able to profile it.
Yeah.
When I talked to Nikki Morgan and I talked about a case of a money mule account processing £100,000, she said, as an MP of a university town, she said, I don't know many students in my university town that could process £100,000 through their bank accounts legitimately.
Right.
So account monitoring is important. The challenge for the banks is what is exceptional. And I know that sort of sounds like a sort of trite question, but actually, I quite often, historically, I keep my cars for quite a long time. So when I do buy a new car, I spend a lot of money.
Right.
Well, not a lot of money, but proportionately a lot of money. For me, £25,000 on a car is a lot of money.
Yeah.
So when all of a sudden the bank sees a transaction for £25,000, is that exceptional? Well, it is. But on the other hand, if I'm sitting there in the process of buying the car, do I want to have to go through the process of phoning the bank and validating my ID, etc., etc.? So trying to work out what is exceptional and what is not is very much about understanding the account profile and managing that. And the banks do get a lot of complaints when they do intervene. But we have to understand, and the banks have got to be, I think, much more positive about the balance of security versus convenience. I've seen one or two banking developments in recent years where they've gone down the convenience route, which the customer has wanted, and then the customer has lost money because actually greater convenience meant less security. And then the banks have said, well, we're not going to give you the money back because it's your fault.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I'd rather have less convenience and more security.
Quite.
So, account monitoring and for the banks to intervene. And one of these areas is what I call payment authorization delay. Now, we've got used to the idea of having a faster payment system.
Yeah.
I can send you some money and essentially I hit send, you look at your bank account and it's going to be there. However, I'm very concerned that faster payment system equals faster fraud. The fraudsters can get the money from me into their fraud account, and then from their first tier fraud account into second and third tier fraud accounts, and the banks just can't chase the money that quickly. So one of the things I'd like your IFAs to think about and possibly to respond to through the discussion forum is I want the banks to offer to their personal, charity and small business customers the opportunity of setting a flag on the account. And what this flag says is when a new payee is created, do not release any high value payment until a clear 24 hours after the payee was created.
Okay.
Because it's this hot period. It's this period where somebody has phoned up and they have said, you need to transfer the money because your account is under attack. That's what happened with Liz. It's what happened with Lisa. It's what I see time and time again. If you put in a 24-hour delay between the creation of the payee, which the fraudster's got to do to get the money paid to themselves, and the release of high value payments, I could identify very quickly, I could identify £1 million just from my own little network of money that would not have been stolen, because by the time the person went to bed that night, they'd gone, that shouldn't have happened. That wasn't right.
Yeah.
But of course, by then, the money's already 2 or 3 tiers down the fraud network.
Yeah.
So I would say banks offer to your customers a payment authorization delay. It has to be set up in advance. One bank recently made a bit of a song and dance about this, and they said, when customers are making the first payment to a new payee, they can choose to delay it by 24 hours.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, bank.
Yeah.
You really clearly don't understand.
Yeah.
Because if I'm on the phone to a fraudster and the fraudster is saying, your account is under attack, you need to move the money now. If I'm willing to move the money in 24 hours time, the fraudster is going to say, no, if you leave it 24 hours, it'll all have gone by then.
They build that sense of urgency and scaring. Yeah.
It's the whole social engineering is about urgency, scaring. And if we actually created this payment authorization delay, it would be particularly helpful for older people, for vulnerable people, because one of the things that I want to see as part of the payment authorization delay is what I call second party notification. So if my elderly mother, I'm not a signature on her account, but what I would like is for my bank, for her bank, on her instruction, to be able to say, if I create a new payee, send a message to my son.
Yeah.
And then I can phone her up and say, Mum, why have you just created such and such and such as a new payee, in the knowledge that no money would go to that new payee for 24 hours. Now, when I put this to the bank 3 years ago, they said, our customers do not want it because it will be an inconvenience, and we can't do it for regulatory reasons. So let's deal with those two issues.
Yeah.
So here is my question to you, Phil, and to all the IFAs. When was the last time you made a payment of more than £500 to a new payee and you did not have the payee's account details 24 hours before they needed the payment?
Yeah, quite. Take your point.
And I can identify one scenario. In 3 years of asking the question, I've only come up with one scenario which is a private individual buying a second-hand car from a private seller. You go to the person's home, you see the car, you've got insurance in place. If you can make the payment immediately, you can drive away with the car.
Yeah.
If not, you're going to have to go back. But for that one in hundreds of thousands of transactions, actually, that's an inconvenience that I think we may just have to live with, because the benefit, and it's a choice as well. It's a service. People can say, I want it, or people can say that I don't want it. On the regulatory issue, this one I find slightly more worrying in terms of the bank's approach. We all know that we expect the faster payment system to actually make the payment very quickly. But what do the regulations say? Now, according to some of the banks, the regulations say the payment must be made by the end of the business day. There is an alternative interpretation of the regulations, which is the payment must be made by the end of the business day following the date on which it was authorized, i.e. tomorrow.
Yeah.
Actually, both of those interpretations is entirely irrelevant. And it's irrelevant for this reason. If I go into my online banking system now on today, and I say, please make a payment to you next Wednesday, the bank is complying with the faster payment system by making the payment next Wednesday. The fact that it's in the future, the fact that it isn't today doesn't matter, because the authorization is an authorization to do it next Wednesday. So if I say to my bank forever, my authorization, my instruction is, do not release the payment until 24 hours after the payment is created, their faster payment clock doesn't start until 24 hours time. Yeah. Therefore, there is no regulatory issue. They just didn't want to do it. And lo and behold, after I raised this issue with them 3 years ago, and they all put their hands up and said, we're not going to do it, in the new code of practice, there is the provision for the banks to implement payment authorization delay.
And you mentioned earlier, you've seen actual examples where people would not have lost money had that been in place.
Liz would not have lost her £33,000 if that had been in place. And I can identify a significant number of people. And that's just from my tiny client portfolio. Yeah. There are lots and lots of people. And I mean, I'm going to say hundreds of millions of pounds. Certainly tens of millions, but I actually believe hundreds of millions of pounds. And historically, all of that money has been lost to the individual, not to the bank. And that, quite frankly, is part of my concern, is until the banks are made liable, they're not going to put systems in place to resolve it.
No.
So then the other thing I just want to talk about is confirmation of payee. This is another thing the banks should have done and haven't done. So just to remind everybody, when you create a payee in your accounting system, in your bank system, you put in an account name, a sort code, and account number. The banks completely, absolutely, entirely ignore the account name when making the payment. Now, I had a big argument with one bank because somebody set up a payment and they got a message back from the bank that said, do you wish to authorize this payment for £10,000 to Tom Smith? And they went, well, yes. Now, what they believed was the bank had checked the name on the receiving account and said it was Tom Smith. No, the receiving account was something entirely different. It was fraud. They even got a text message after the money was sent saying, we're confirming you've made a payment of £10,000 to Tom Smith. But that was the name in their payee record, not the actual payee's account. What confirmation of payee is going to allow us to do is to put in the account name that we've been given by the payee and the sort code and the account number. Our bank will then go to the receiving bank and they will come back with one of three answers. Either the name you've given is a perfect match, or the name you've given doesn't match at all, it's entirely different, or it's similar, but it's not quite the same.
Right.
Now, Confirmation of payee was meant to come in the middle of this year. We already know the earliest it will now come in is the beginning of 2020, because the banks haven't yet managed to agree the specification and how it's all going to work. Now, I'm going to just make this observation. We've had the faster payment system since 2008. There is no technical reason why we couldn't have had effective account monitoring, payment authorization delay, and confirmation of payee since 2008. There's nothing technical about those three developments that could not have been done 11 years ago. So I'm now going to read something very specifically. This is my personal definition of gross negligence. Gross negligence is when an individual makes a conscious and voluntary decision to do or not to do something with a clear understanding of a foreseeable risk of loss that is directly attributable to the action or inaction. Okay, now for your listeners, I'll run that again slightly more quickly. Gross negligence is when an individual makes a conscious and voluntary decision to do or not to do something with a clear understanding of a foreseeable risk of loss that is directly attributable to that action or inaction. So, for example, writing down your PIN on a piece of paper and keeping it in your wallet with your card is gross negligence.
Yeah.
Because it's something you're choosing to do, and it has a very clear and obvious risk of loss. Now, I'm putting forward a proposition that says, by virtue of the fact that the banks did not implement effective account monitoring, payment authorization delay, or confirmation of payee, is potentially gross negligence on the part of the banks.
Yeah.
Now, there's a topic for conversation.
Yeah. Richard, you also mentioned TV license TV license fraud.
Sorry. Let me tell you. Yeah, let me explain the TV license scam, right? Because this just shows how sophisticated these guys are becoming. So what happened? Actually, this is Liz's story, right? But it's also, I've seen it in other cases. What happened is the victim receives an email that says, you haven't paid your TV license. If you don't pay it by midnight tonight, then you will be subject to a fine. So there's an urgency about doing it. Now, in Liz's case, she'd lost her husband of 50 years, relatively recently. She'd moved from the original family home into a small apartment. She'd done all the transfers of gas, electricity, etc., etc. So when this message arrived, she went, oh, the TV license. So she went online and she paid it. 2 hours later, her bank phones her up and says, hello, Liz, we're really sorry to tell you, actually, the payment you've just made for your TV license was fraud. But don't worry about it. So you put her into a dark place and say you're the victim of fraud.
Yeah.
You pick her up, you dust her off, and you say, but don't worry about it. We've identified that it's fraud. We've frozen your account with us, and we can arrange for a refund of your money. We're also aware of the fact that you have got 2 other bank accounts with other banks. Those banks will also phone you within the next 2 hours, and they will in turn go through a security process with you and secure your accounts. Oh, great. Thank you. I can relax. Yes, I've been the victim of fraud, but all will be well. So within that 2 hours, both of the other 2 banks phoned her up. Both of them told her her account was at risk and she needed to move all of her money to a safe account. And that was the fraud.
Yeah.
There was no phone call from her bank. There was no phone call from either of the other 2 banks that she banked with. Her whole banking environment was compromised. And it's this element of social engineering that is so clever that you make somebody apparently the victim of fraud. You tell them they've been the victim of fraud, but you are now the good guy. You are the bank. You are going to make everything perfectly okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's the TV license scam. There's something similar with HR, with revenue and customs, of people being told that they haven't actually paid the final amount of their income tax bill. and that they need to pay that immediately. And it's all about the banking security, because, for example, there is one bank now which allows you to sign onto your account using your 16-digit card number from your debit card.
Okay.
Well, of course, how do you pay something like your TV license in that situation? You pay it by using the 16 digits of your debit card. So if you happen to bank with that bank, the fraudsters have now got the 16 digits of your bank card. They can now log into the first page of your banking system. They then phone you up pretending to be your bank. Hi, I'm phoning you from ABC Bank. Could you please give me 2 digits from your PIN and 3 digits from your password? Well, that's what your bank does. But because they've already got your 16-digit bank card number, which is actually a new development. The bank have only recently introduced this. Historically, with this particular bank, you had to know your 10-digit customer number, which of course was secret.
Yeah.
Now they're saying you can access the account using your card number, which is public. And I'm going, hey bank, you've given us a more convenient solution, but actually you've created a security risk.
This is the bit that I can't get my head round, is the stupidity of a lot of this when it comes to the banks. Again, I apologise for coming back to my own mother, but this is what prompted this in the first place.
Yeah.
Is that if I won the lottery this weekend and I'd gone into my bank to pay in the cheque today, they'd be all over me like a rash to want to talk to me. But they know this stuff is going on, yet a lady in her 80s walks into a bank and asks to make these payments over consecutive days, and they don't even flinch. It's just quite beyond me, yet they know this stuff is going on.
Oh yeah, the banks are not doing anything like as much as they could do and they should do. I will be fair, touch on one thing. There is something now called the banking protocol. And that has actually been very successful. And the way the banking protocol works is if an individual walks into the bank, and particularly an older or vulnerable person walks into the bank and tries to withdraw a large amount of money, then that can be £3,000-4,000. So I'm not talking tens of thousands of pounds. But if the bank staff are not satisfied that this is a genuine withdrawal of cash for a genuine reason, if they have any hesitation about the genuineness of this transaction, they actually can simply phone 999.
Right.
And the police will immediately respond across, I think it's now every police force. And the police will then attend the branch, and then they will chat to the individual. And what they've actually found is, in a significant number of cases, it's because somebody has knocked on this elderly person's front door, offered to fix a roof tile, ended up saying, oh, we had to do this, this, and this, and you now owe us £3,000. And they've sent the person off to the bank to get the cash. So the police now drive home with the intended victim in the police car. And lo and behold, the rogue trader is still sitting there waiting for them to come back with the money. But actually, who turns up but the police?
Yeah, I didn't know about that one.
Number of arrests. And I think the figure, I did see a figure, I think it was £100 million has actually been saved through this new banking protocol. But that's primarily focused around cash withdrawals rather than bank transfers. And I think they need to look at how they deal with the bank transfer issue. And of course, confirmation of payee will be an important part of this, because the bank will be able to say, well, I dealt with a gentleman, he'd lost £48,000. He went into the bank, he filled in a back transfer form, he wrote his name as the name of the account to which the money was going to go, and then the sort code and the account number. It's what the fraudsters had told him to do. Well, because the bank couldn't check that the receiving account was in his name, they transferred the money to an account which proved to be fraudulent.
Yeah.
We had confirmation of payee, which we should have had 10 years ago. Once we have that, it'll be a little step forward. There is no silver bullet, but we've just got to tighten up across absolutely every area of this whole thing.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm going to challenge your IFAs to do is to actually talk to their MPs. Have a really serious think about the issues that we've raised today, and really go away and say that you want to have a chat with your MP about holding the banks to account. So the Treasury Select Committee has over the last 3 months been running an inquiry into economic crime. And I think the more MPs that contact the Treasury Select Committee and actually say, we are concerned about the way in which the banks are dealing with this, and we believe that the banks have not dealt with it properly in the past. But let me end up, if I may, with a number of key messages. So let me just quite quickly go through these. First of all, please remind your customers, your clients, that banks do not currently use the account name. So everything is based on sort code and account number. Confirmation of payee is coming, but today everything relies on sort code and account number.
Yeah.
Never rush into making a payment to a new payee. Right? I find it really difficult to find any situation where a payment has to be made in that much of a rush. And one of the things that I do with my clients when I actually win cases and they're going to pay me a fee, which obviously, it's quite a nice thing to happen, is I say, create me as a payee and then send me a random sum of money of less than £1, followed by an email that says done.
Yeah.
And I look in my bank and I say, right, okay, Liz, thank you very much. You have sent me 31p, and I will phone Liz up and say, the amount you sent to me is 31p. She knows my voice. We've talked in the past. Don't do the confirmation by email, because I've seen a case where the entire email process was being hacked.
Right.
So somebody actually, yeah, okay, do you like this one? So a little aside here. So if I was due to pay £50,000 to his builder, he was limited on the amount he could pay. So he paid the first £10,000, sent an email to the builder saying, I've just paid the first £10,000, and got an email back saying, thank you very much. But the email was coming back from the fraudster, not from the builder. You need to recognise that you need to be really careful around that.
Yeah.
Then, very, very important, no bank will ever tell a person to move their money to a safe account. If your account is genuinely under attack in some way, then the bank can freeze it. They can secure it. They don't need you to move the money. Never, ever do that. I've got a couple of cases at the moment involving huge sums of money where the people have been contacted on behalf of the Financial Conduct Authority and or their bank and or their police to cooperate in an international investigation in bank fraud. And in one case have moved money to Dubai, in another case to the United Arab Emirates. And in one case, they were told, we are moving the money into the bank's cloud account where it will be safe and free from fraud. But they were told they were assisting with police investigations.
Yeah.
No, that does not happen. And then the other final thought is, if you ever receive an unexpected payment into your account, followed by a phone call that says, oh, we're really sorry, we've accidentally sent you some money, can you send it back? Phone the bank, don't send it back. Because what one team of fraudsters have worked out is if they can gain access to somebody's account, they then look at the existing payees on the account. And if they can identify a small local business, they make the payment, the fraudulent payment, from the victim's account into this existing payee. And then they phone up the payee and say, oh, we're really sorry, we've sent some money to you by mistake. Can you please send it back to us? Our sort code and account number is, and then they send the money back. But of course, they're actually sending the money to a fraudster. So if ever you receive unexpected amounts of money in your account, phone the bank.
So those are some practical things that financial advisors can be doing with their clients now. Yes. And they could be doing that through the newsletter, at a seminar, something like that.
Yeah. And I'm going to put this offer on the table, right? If they're going to put out something like a newsletter and they just want to have it proofread, I'm willing to just proofread an email, a newsletter, to just be sure that actually the messages are coming across clearly and are correct. And I would do that because I want to see fraud stamped out. Now, I have 3 objectives. I want to make sure people who are the victims of fraud get their money back. I want to make sure that the banks lose less money through fraud, because at the end of the day, we all pay the bill. And I want to see fraudsters caught and convicted.
Yeah, yeah. With your permission, we have your contact details and we'll make that available to our viewers. So that's at a local level, but your challenge to the wider industry, the wider profession, would be to start talking to their MPs.
Yes, yeah. And if they want any guidance on how to approach their MPs, or if they have anybody who they discover has been a victim, talk to their MPs. We need to put pressure. The particular focal point, let's end with this, right? My big challenge for 2019 is to look at historic cases of authorized push payment fraud, which currently victims cannot recover because the new reimbursement scheme is not retrospective. So we are facing something in the order of £1 billion of consumer money that has been lost through authorized payment fraud in the last 5 years. My task for 2019 is to get the regulations changed to allow the victims of that £1 billion of loss, so that those people can challenge their bank and the receiving bank and receive that money in refunds. And if any of the IFAs can help me do that, that is the challenge. It is a relatively small change in the regulations. Inevitably, the banks are not very keen on that idea. But actually, to be honest, £1 billion in banking terms is not a huge amount of money.
Sure.
But for 50,000 people who on average have lost £20,000, it is life-changing.
Yeah.
And it's about fairness and justice and integrity. And I'm challenging the banks to actually say, this has gone on because you haven't had effective account monitoring. You haven't had confirmation of payee. You haven't had payment authorization delay. You should have had all of those things. And incidentally, you're not actually compliant with the payment services regulations in terms of dealing with unauthorized transactions.
Yeah.
So those are my 4 threads of challenge. If anybody wants to come on board, welcome.
Yeah, I'm certain they will. We've seen financial advisors rising to challenges like that in the past when it comes to pensions and so on and so forth. And I think, first of all, thank you to you for your time today. Okay. Thank you also for the work that you do, because somebody needs to be doing it. No pressure, Richard. But thank you so much for being with us today. I'm really looking forward to seeing how our financial advisor colleagues respond to this in both our Facebook group and in our private forum as well. So thank you to everybody for watching this today. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have. And a final thank you to you, Richard, for your time.
Thank you, Phil.